So I wanted to give you warm greetings. Boston is just as chilly as this. We just had a snowstorm a couple of days ago. We're a hardy stock up in New England, and you are a hardy stock here in Ohio. Lou mentioned that we've got this unitary curriculum that emphasizes spoken-written language relationships. So I'm going to talk a lot about oral language, but all the time I'm thinking, what is that layering in for kids when they get into this sort of written language domain? That's my long-term interest is on getting people to think about language not just as reading and writing, or not just as listening and speaking, but to get them to see the relationships between them. That's my bias. Every person has a bias. My bias is that if you understand these oral written language relationships, it'll really help you with working with kids, whether they're your own child. My eldest was only able to graduate from school because he went to a school like Lawrence School, a place called Landmark School north of Boston. Just hopefully this will enhance your understanding. So our agenda is going to really be flexible. Agendas are made to be broken, but we're going to talk about principles for supporting preschool language, and then talk about these early supports for vocabulary and narrative development. I'm going to take a brief peek at semantic features of words and how it's a different way of thinking about vocabulary and word learning that I think may be of interest to you, and then I'll kind of lead up to this idea of growing these personal sequence narratives that will support school-age stories. So a really good friend of mine, Hollis Scarborough, language is complex stuff, and I'm sure you guys have been weaving through this sort of complex terminology that people use to talk about language and trying to make sense of it yourselves. Hollis created this rope metaphor, and I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about how language, spoken and written language, develop over time. So along this bottom axis here, you've got approximately where different grades might be: kindergarten, first, second, third, right on out through sixth, and then on beyond as well. So we're exposed to oral language, and that's this stuff up here at the top. We get background knowledge early on through videos, through parents taking us on neat excursions to places, talking about it. And at the same time, we're starting to develop these sort of ingredients for what is going to be word recognition, and later reading fluency, spelling as well. And at the beginning, all these skills are kind of unrelated for the young child. And over time, with good, structured teaching, like the teaching that kids get here, those skills start to come together, and you start to get this increasingly integrated relationship between oral and written language, and pretty soon they're kind of fused together. A child reads a book, it increases their oral vocabulary. A child hears new words in their spoken words, or engages in new experiences, and they recognize that experience or that word in print. And it's all hopefully really automatic and fluent. So this is a neat way of thinking about language, and I just wanted to share it with you. Hopefully it helps you. So I want to talk mostly about the kind of language comprehension preparation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about sort of early phonological awareness activities you do to prep kids for word recognition and spelling. That's a really important area. But we've got limited time together, so I'm going to focus primarily on comprehension. So catching kids early, as you know, is very important because it can leverage our brain's ability to adapt. We know, I can vouch for it with my own oldest son, that if you catch a child later, it's more expensive and takes a lot more time to support them. We can do it, and we can do it with great success. My son is now chief in the Navy. He's got hundreds of people working under him. He loves supporting them. His things can turn out well. So that socialization piece of catching kids early if possible is really important. And we know that for people within society, that if you don't get the kind of structured, systematic support for language learning and use of technologies to help you kind of work your way around certain skills that just are having a hard time materializing for you, that without that kind of support, we know that it can cost an individual between $1.2 and $1.5 million during their lifetime. So kudos to all of you for recognizing that your child needed some support and getting them to the right place for that. So I'm going to use a couple of terms, but we're going to move to the 30,000-foot level just for a second. Imagine that you have 20 studies that have looked at something, and they showed that that thing tended to work. Well, each study has a finding. If you're a data analyst, please bear with me. I'm just trying to explain what a meta-analysis is. So you can take similarly constructed studies that are looking at the same phenomenon and have a given outcome, and you can collapse the findings across the studies to give you a super robust sense of what is real and what is not real. It's not just an accident from that given study. We got 20 studies that are saying the same thing. Okay, so that's what a meta-analysis is. You with me? Yes. Okay. And pardon me if you feel, I don't mean to be speaking down, I just want to make we're on the same page. So they generate something called an effect size. So you can kind of pool those findings and you go, this is a large effect, this is a moderate effect, this is a small to moderate effect, but very real and important. Even a small to moderate effect, that's usually what you get in behavioral studies. So you got to really look at those. If across studies you're getting that, that's still powerful. We good? Yeah. All right, so 30,000-foot level, we're going to move down to the next level and look at some of the key findings about meta-analytic studies. We know that if you do language enhancement in the home, that it has large effects on children's oral language skills. And those oral language skills then later aid reading comprehension. I'm talking generally, but we'll get into some nice specific nitty-gritty examples of what language-enhanced intervention means. We know that training parents for supporting home language, a little bit like this, but actually with follow-up, where the parent will come back and ask questions, and you'll give them feedback around ways that you were attempting to support language. But we know that parent training for supporting home language has moderate to large effects. That is huge and robust. Super important that it's going to improve kids' oral language skills and also just general cognitive abilities. Systematic book reading routines, and I'll share those with you. By the way, they're important not just for preschool kids, but also for early school age, and in some cases even later school age, that it yields moderate-sized effects on print knowledge and oral language skills. Remember we talked about oral written language? So there's some basic, wanted to just take a moment to talk about some examples of things that are really useful to do with students, and that is with children. And that is when you model the target language behavior that you want. So if you want your child speaking in longer sentences, then you need to model those very clearly so they can hear them. Whether you're a teacher in a classroom or a parent, if you speak clearly, children listen to what you say. You may not think that, but they do listen to you, and it registers for them. You want to make sure that you provide contextual support in the home. You should have easy-to-read materials, picture books lying around. If you have a child who's in middle school or high school who really struggles with reading, comic books, I know there's some comic books that you probably don't want your child reading right now, but comic books that you select and leave lying around in the bathroom, out in the living room, whatever, making sure that they're available. Picture books, even for older students that have words with them, are actually beneficial. You're not you don't need to force kids to read only text when they're at home. It should be fun. It should be enjoyable. Descriptive talking, and I'm going to give you concrete examples of all of these, but we're kind of at the 10,000-foot level now, hitting some key features of the landscape. Descriptive talking about things that are going on around you is very important. So simply because the child is observing and seeing things around them, that's not sufficient. There needs to be language that's describing what's happening. When your child or adolescent communicates with you, they make that effort to communicate, you go, wow, he actually tried to talk to me about something. Responding in a really positive way to it, and just in a way that is not off-putting to them, but really validating, is super important. So that's what we call natural reinforcement. And the other piece is when your child or adolescent is talking about something and they give you some information, you can expand it or recast what they're saying, but in a way that isn't like they're being corrected. You're responding authentically. Your child says, that was a cool movie. And you go, yeah, I love the way that, it was a really neat movie. I love the way that, and so you're expanding and adding insights into it. All children benefit from that kind of expansion. So we good so far? Still 10,000-foot level. You'd like to get some nitty-gritty. So let's move to that level now. So we talked about modeling and engagement. So I'll just use the example of going somewhere. In this case, it's to the beach. Although on a day like today, it's difficult to imagine that, but we can think of sunnier days to come. So you're going to talk with the child before the trip. So talking about what is going to be happening. What's the planning that you're engaging in? What are the things that you're hoping to see or do there? What do they think about that? When you're there, you're going to talk about what you're seeing. Wow, we're at a tide pool and amazing. Look at this. You got an empty shell here, but there's a crab in it. And How do you think he found it? And what happens when the water goes out? How do they survive? So that sort of discussion, and it needs to be socially appropriate to the child's level. If they're an adolescent, it may be a higher level type of discussion. I see that family down the beach, they're kind of fighting with each other. What do you think's going on? And they're kind of entering, they're looking, you're kind of conjecturing, talking about what's happening. Or do you think those clouds are going to be coming in pretty soon that you see out there? So it's that sort of discussion of what's happening while you're there. And then last of all, before there was this stuff called print that we require our kids to read and produce, there were oral histories, as you know. So that whole piece of recounting is super important. So just asking simple questions, not sort of strenuous school teacher-ish, in the most caricatured way, but what did you think about so-and-so? Or what did you enjoy most? Like if we were to do that again, what would you like to do? That sort of recounting is very useful. So what it's doing is we're building a model for the world. And that model has a past, a present, and a future. And you're basically giving them language to talk about past, present, and future, or helping to increase their language about that. So I want to move on to this idea of family-guided, routines-based intervention. Some of the routines, for those of you with middle school or high school kids, you're going to need to kind of like up the ante and think about what are routines that you do with your child. Maybe they mow the lawn. Maybe that's a routine that they have to go through. So you want to think flexibly about these routines. So here are examples for younger children. Here are examples of like standard morning routines. Things like just greeting one another in the morning. Each family is going to have their own microculture where the routines are different. Maybe making your bed, opening the curtains, maybe eating breakfast is a routine. Hygiene is important, dressing. These are all concrete examples of what we call routines. So they are routine. That means they happen again and again. They typically have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and so on. Here are examples of evening routines that many families have. Interestingly, when I was in the Middle East, I talked about prayer routines as being important routines that people engage in. But in fact, you don't have to be in the Middle East to talk about that. So prayer may be an important part of your family's experience, or maybe your family meditates. You spend a time when you just sort of are quiet and pensive about things. Those are, if you do it regularly, anything you do regularly is a routine. So I wanted to be sure and be flexible and accommodate different family cultures and point out. So again, you're going to talk about before, during, and after, and you've got language learning opportunities there. So you're probably saying, okay, you talked about routines. I sort of get it. What really makes up a routine? So I thought it might be useful to talk about a Storytime routine. This would be with a younger child, but it could also be with children who are school age as well. I read with my kids. I have 5 sons who are now off and running and off to the races in various ways, but they love books. We have 2 libraries in our home. Every kid's bedroom is a library of the books that they love. And we would read these books, and sometimes we would read them over and over, 2 or 3 times if they were really good books. And I would just lie down next to them, or as they got older, maybe I'd sit in a chair next to them, and we would take turns reading, or if it was a child who struggled with reading, I would read. And here are the elements of the routine, but it would get hybridized to older students to make it more appropriate for their social level. So it's got a beginning. So what do you look at some pictures, or you read a few sentences and you say, what do you think's going to happen? This is the beginning. Even before that, it may be as simple as, which of these two books do you want to read? The idea of choosing a book gives the child or adolescent authority. They have a voice in this choosing. You also want to think about what are the outcomes that you want out of that. So for example, it might be that for a younger child, it's pointing at pictures that you name, labeling, looking at pictures. Maybe they don't know yet which way a book goes, so they're learning to turn the pages. What's important is not to think of reading in a really narrow way, but think of what reading is. It's just any kind of material that has print, maybe pictures as well, and it can behave somewhat similarly, not always identically, but so there are a lot of different sorts of reading materials. A photo album, you may not think of it as reading, but if the photo album is organized by time, there's a story in that photo album, and recounting that is really useful. You can do it with adolescents. I just want to keep reminding you, this is not just for micro people, this is for older kids as well. The other thing that makes it a routine is that it's systematic. It has some predictable elements to it. And then the other thing that makes it a routine is that it's has a repetitious element, and it's predictable. When you sit down together, you know what you can predict. When I met some of you when you came in, we greeted one another, and it's a routine that we know. It's not always identical, but it's a kind of general frame. It was, hi, Mrs. Honeycutt, it's nice to meet you. We talked about our kids, and wished each other well. That's a sort of standard greeting routine. It's repetitious. It's somewhat predictable. It's got authentic parts that are real for that moment. So, wanted to sort of move on to the next, excuse me. You're not going to be able to, most of you will not be able to understand the language here. So I just want you to be aware of that. That's irrelevant. I want you to think about this as a routine. What makes it a routine? And what does this child already know about the role of book reading routines? And this will get at several of your questions about this sort of resistance factor in a kind of indirect way.
Evo ti baci čitavog, Ovako. Stavi sve tu. Čitaj. Ajde.
Okay, what is that teaching us? What does the child know, and what is that teaching us? Yeah, it's fun. And some of the communication we have to do with our kids is not fun. You know, we're redirecting them in ways they don't want to get redirected around important life skill things. So it's fun. What else? Yeah.
Reading is different for everybody. So she was reading, although clearly just babbling, but so it's not, she doesn't know letters and she doesn't know words, but she's reading for her.
She's reading, and what does she know about reading? That it is fun, and what makes it fun? Pardon? You're together. Boy, weren't you feeling like those times when you're most connected with your child, that kind of captures that same sort of shared joy? So obviously it's not always going to be that kind of pinnacle experience that you have, but the more often that your language and literacy use can be around this kind of joy and discovery, that's really important. This child knows that on the page, there's something that gets communicated. They know that it's shared, that most reading is a form of communication. And that's really important. So the joy piece is important. A friend of Lou's and mine, Marianne Wolf, talked about this sort of zeitgeist, this sort of sense of just being there in the moment. That's probably the most important piece. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some kind of nitty-gritty details around something called dialogic reading. It's a fancy term, but if you think of a dialogue, it's a back and forth between you and your child. For those of you with middle schoolers or upper grade schoolers, you can just think about how this same behavior could be adapted to higher level texts. So typically it's with something that has a picture book or questions, though. So how many of you are familiar with this book, Make Way for Ducklings? Okay, if you're from the Boston area, it's super familiar to us. McCloskey was a writer of New England, and this is a story. If you've ever been to Boston Garden, the Commons there, this statue is there that's based on this book. It's basically a story about some ducks that hatch some ducklings on the Charles River, and they need to get to the Boston Garden for the summer after they're hatched. And there are a bunch of streets between the river and Boston Garden. So you got some context for it. So there's different levels of dialogic reading. The first is called labeling, where you're basically just focusing on labeling things that are being seen. So that's basic vocabulary for labeling. The next is describing what's happening, describing any actions, key actions. And then the highest level is drawing inferences. So for those of you with grade schoolers, you might want to be, or middle schoolers, you're checking to make sure they know what is happening. Maybe that they know some key vocabulary words that you hear them using. But you may be spending more time around drawing inferences. Like, what do you think is going to happen next? Given what we just saw, how are they going to solve this problem? So here's an example of level one. Here's a policeman, probably in the 1940s maybe. And here is the mother duck trying to make its way to Boston Garden. And he's stopped the traffic here. So here's the simple labeling. What kind of animals are these? So the parent's pointing to the ducks. Show me the policeman. That's basic labeling or identification activity. Here's another example. Where is the policeman standing? In the street. Remember we talked about those ideas of expansion and elaboration? Yes, in the street, next to the ducks. So you're expanding the child's utterance. Most kids will tend to give us minimalist utterances, and we're expanding them, and they listen to our expansions. Here's an example of level 2, the describing what's happening. Tell me what Mama Duck is doing. What are the cars doing? And then you could even move it to like the sort of level 3 inference. You could say, why are the cars doing that? What might happen if they didn't stop? So here's another kind of level 2. Tell me what Mama Duck is doing. Mama Duck is walking across the street. Yes. So that's social support. I see Mama Duck walking across the street and her babies are following her. Here's an example of level 3 where the child has to draw inferences. That means you're connecting what you're seeing with something that isn't explicitly on the page. It's somewhere else. So why are the ducks crossing the street? Where did the ducks start from? So that's starting to create a world model. There and then, now, future. So that's part of what we're doing with our kids, whatever age they are. It's helping them with their executive functioning to think about what happened before. Let's process it. Okay, what are we seeing happening now? So what do we want to do in the future? Or what will happen? That's what these discussions lay the groundwork for. Good language teaching supports executive functioning. Here's another example, level 3. Why are the ducks crossing the street? They want to get to the pond in the public garden. And then here's the parent expansion. Yes, they want to get to the pond in Boston Public Garden where they will be safe. So, by the way, I don't want to turn into a grammarian right now, but if you notice, these expansions start to introduce more complicated sentence patterns, complex sentences, and that prepares the child for academic language that they're going to encounter in text, particularly in grade 3 on. Okay, so here's Claire. She's 3.5 years old, and she's telling a story. Now, I want you to know that she's going to say something that sounds like britches, but I think she's talking about birches, like birch trees in the woods. Another thing is that she's drawing from her knowledge of like Wile E. Coyote and the 2-finger poke that you do when someone's like attacking you. You give them the 2-finger poke. And so that's a little bit of background knowledge. So here's Claire.
Well, once upon a time, I was walking in the jungle, and I stopped. And when I stopped, I just heard 2 snapping branches. But then I knew I was surrounded with hungry bears and coyotes, and one of the biggest coyotes and bear grabbed me, and I did the double eye poke, and that made them startled. And they let go of me, and then I went as fast as I could until I got to my truck and drove home, and I did. And then when I drove home to my mommy and daddy.
And so you were safe?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
And the bear and coyote never found me again.
Don't you love it? So this is a child with obviously strong language skills, but children acquire that language through the kind of discussions that parents have with them by being read stories. They give them a lot of language to draw on, that it's safe for them. Whatever language abilities they have, that it's a safe place for them to use the language that they have. For those of you with younger kids, here's the sense of coming attractions. For those of you with children who are in grade school or middle school or whatever, this will let you see some of how that oral language work ends up migrating into the child's written language. So I'm going to start briefly at the word level to emphasize the importance of vocabulary. I think that may be a waterfall in Hawaii, Lou. So it's really important for whatever language work that teachers are doing with students for it to be theme or topic centered. It's got to have content. So here at Lawrence School, at both of the schools, they get it. They understand that. But many schools don't, and they'll assign kids worksheets with totally decontextualized, i.e., sentences that have no relationship to each other, and they're supposed to do something with those sentences. So theme-centered instruction is super important. Let me give you a reason why. Read list 1 to yourself, look at it. And in a study where list 1 shows up and then it disappears and you have students recall or participants recall the words, they'll recall these words and then they disappear and they give them a new list, the list on the right, list 2. So you can read through these words here. And they're there for about 10 seconds and they disappear and then they recall them. So in a study like that, which list do you think that most people recall the most? Exactly. It ends up that many studies have shown that theme-centered work really reduces the load on working memory for kids. Some people actually do better with list 1. It's typically people who have really strong language skills and they are building a kind of zany story about those words that's memorable to them. So it's a wacky story, but it's so wacky that they can remember the words, but they have strong language skills. Most people, it's list 2. So you want to make sure that kids are exposed to, this was related to our question earlier from one of you, is it okay to kind of bypass reading at home and have exposed children to audiobooks? And the answer is yes, absolutely. They need, they should do homework to the extent that they feel comfortable doing homework and to the extent that Lawrence School feels it's important for your kids. But don't feel guilty if you're engaging in other kinds of language interaction in addition to book reading. So a lot of modalities for taking in that information. We'll pretend that I wanted to take you to my native New England. This is a picture drawn by or painted by whom? Who knows the painter? It's a guy named Winslow Homer, and this title of this is called Breezing Up. And so what you do with kids when you're introducing a topic or theme is you want to give them some kind of visual material or manipulables that stimulate their language. It needs to be fun for them. It should be something engaging. And then you're going to have them examine the picture. Kids with ADHD may start to identify really irrelevant little pieces of the picture. So you may need to guide their visual analysis to identify the more important items on the page. And then have them call out words that they already know. So these might be the kinds of words that they know. And they would use terms like guy steering, sky. For this piece right here, they might call it just a pole. Or this is a steering thing back here. And this is a cloth. And then as teachers, we take what kids know and we try to attach new vocabulary that is more specific to the content. So the guy steering actually is a captain on a boat. The sky actually has clouds in it. This water, these are actually called white caps when you get that sort of white and so on. This is a sailboat, etc. So taking known and adding what is not known, that's a rich, powerful teaching strategy. And then this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately and have found it to be really powerful in this pilot writing clinic we've been doing. I'm having people take key vocabulary from the theme and having them guide children in identifying semantic features. So semantic features are like these specific component meanings, like oak, part of the boat, in the stern, steers the boat. Our brains store vocabulary in terms of semantic features. And you can do that. Also, semantic features help us identify similarities and differences. So if you think of a high-level high school class where they're having to identify similarities and differences between Montagues and Capulets in Romeo and Juliet, it's the same idea. What are shared features? What are dissimilar features? And then they attach language to that. So you can guide students in identifying these key features. So who's the one who uses the thing? What's its use or function? What is it made of? What's its location? These are semantic features of this noun. And what's really cool is that you can then resurrect them in sentence level work. It prepares students for that. So here was the semantic feature work that you did with them. Here's a low-level sentence. The captain, what did he do? What was his function? He steered the boat. And then here's a higher-level sentence. The captain steered the rudder in the stern of the boat. You got it? So vocabulary work actually ties in directly to sentence-level work that you can do with students to prepare them. So standing in the stern of the boat, see, standing in the stern of the boat, the captain steered the massive oak rudder. So this is super powerful for getting kids' language sort of revved up and going. So if you have a preschool child, you can take an important object and you can talk about who pushes the mower. Where do you push the mower? Where is daddy or the gardener or me, if mom's the one who pushes the mower, where do I push it? What's the mower made of? So there are different levels of this same idea. So it's really important to teach sentences in a sort of structured, systematic way. This is starting from simple sentences and not use vocabulary that is way over the kids' heads for talking about sentence parts. So distilling it down to real simple terms for thinking about sentence parts. I want to talk about the personal sequence narrative because I promised that you'd get to see how it sort of resurrects back up in school age. So it's basically a logically sequenced story where the child is recounting something initially. It's got an introductory sentence that tells who's doing what, where, and when. And then the body has these sort of sequence words that helps the child to sequence the events. You can do it orally, you can do it in writing, you can listen to a story and tell the parts of the sequence back. So what's neat is that personal sequence narrative that maybe you worked on with little kids, where you were talking about, we're going to the beach. First we did this, then we did this, next after that. And you can springboard it right into writing type activity. So here's the oral language activity. Let's read this together. Go ahead. Today, we're going to... Next, we'll drive to the shore. Finally, we'll have our picnic. Okay, so that's what's going to be happening. Remember what you talk about before? So this, and then in the recount later, you can like mutually recall the events that happened when you went. So that's the oral language preparation. And in classrooms, you can do the same kind of oral sequencing. So here's an example of an early 3-part personal sequence narrative for a child who's age 7 at Landmark in the summer program that they have where they take in very young kids who've got 1 or 2 family members who have dyslexia and the child's struggling in kindergarten and so on. So family history of dyslexia. And here's the child recounting the daily routine there at the school. And you first have them draw the picture of the event. You see the word first? It's green. Remember a stoplight starts things off? We'll come back to this, but I just want to show you the pictures first. Here's then. Remember it's yellow, it's sort of in the middle. And then here's last, or finally. So even if they can't decode, kids first learn these kind of Gestalt pictures of words, and it associates it with initial, middle, end. And then the child goes back and tells the story, relates the story to their peers. And here's the way it works with expansion. Remember that expansion idea? Here's how it can work in a classroom. First, I get cookies. Teacher, where did you get the cookies? And the child says, in the cafeteria. Now say the whole sentence to me. First, I get cookies in the cafeteria. Student, then I meet my friends. See, here are the friends. I actually wasn't sure what this was. I thought, for goodness sake, I hope the kid doesn't have a dog or something, you know. But fortunately, these were cookies. So then I meet my friends. Here are the friends talking with each other. Where do you meet your friends? In the lobby. Say the whole sentence. Then I meet my friends in the lobby. So here's the dialogue. Last, I wait for the class bell to ring. Where do you wait? At the foot of the stairs. Say the whole sentence. That should have the word last. Last, I wait for the class bell to ring at the foot of the stairs. So that's how it works. That's oral language prep. Here's a slightly higher level one. The child draws pictures. They struggle a lot with writing, but we want them to be doing sequencing. This weekend, I went skiing with my family. First, we rented ski boots. Then we rented our skis. Next, we went up the lift. After that, what do you think? Skied down the hill. And I think this is some kind of a tag that you have to turn in to get some kind of deposit back on the skis. In conclusion, we really enjoyed ourselves. Okay? So in school, the students can then do this first, then next, after that, finally, and they'll create sequences like this. Every morning we gather in the meeting room for the morning meeting. Let's read this together. First, Mr. Swanson reads some announcements. Next, Mr. Kahn tells us which teachers are absent. After that, we're reminded not to throw snowballs. Finally, the bell rings and we go to class. And then you can have some kind of conclusion sentence. All in all, we enjoy our early morning meeting. So this is taking that same oral narrative production and putting it into a written modality. It can get expanded into things like a process paragraph. You cue the first sentence. Were there many steps for climbing the mountain? So that's a cue the student memorizes. Are there many steps for making chocolate chip cookies? Are there many steps for brushing your teeth? Whatever the topic is, and the sentence that they produce is the topic. So we're trying to get them to do past tense at this level to inflect. There were many steps for climbing the mountain. And here we go, first, then, and so on. Same kind of recall, providing them with some kind of concluding sentence frame that allows them to summarize. And then here's how you start to embellish with details. There were many steps for climbing the mountain. First, the mountain climbers packed their bags. Why or how, fact, they needed to carry light, nutritious foods that would give them energy. Then they began the long trek into base camp. Why or fact, the trek into base camp improved their physical conditioning. So you need to have background knowledge. That's where videos, being read to, pictures, whatever. Any way you can get the content in, and that allows them to generate these why and fact type sentences. So for those of you with young kids, it's a preview of coming attractions. For those of you with students in school, this gives you a sense of the kind of scaffolding and theme-centered support that your children receive here at Lawrence School that allows them to produce some pretty amazing writing, leveraging listening and speaking to aid reading and writing, spoken and written language complementing each other.